Today we're commemorating the Buddha's Parinirvana, or the day that the Buddha died. And there's a lot that we can learn from the character of the Buddha, from the account of his last days, and the teachings he shared with his disciples. Excuse me. Especially the reality of death and impermanence. But this is not a sad commemoration, but a commemoration of gratitude for the life and the teachings of the Buddha. And the one thing that can connect us to his life and to all of our lives is the fact that impermanence is in all things. To prepare for this talk, I read the Pali Parinirvana Sutta, the Buddhist account of the last days of the Buddha. And the one thing I appreciated about this sutta, or the sutra, was the Buddha's humanness. By the time the Buddha had come to the end, he was 80 years old. I mean, 80's old in our society. Can you imagine 80 years old in Indian society 2,500 years ago? There was no penicillin. There weren't things called hospitals. And nutrition was hard to come by. And we know the Buddha himself, he wasn't kind to his body when he was young. 6 years as an ascetic, so malnourished that his eyes were sunken in. And it was said that you could count the bones of his spine through his stomach. He was so thin. Also, too, the sutta tells us, and all of the suttas tell us, of the Buddha's humanness, how he was like us. Throughout his life, he suffered from severe headaches, incapacitating back pain, infected wounds. The compilers of the suttas do not hide the Buddha's frailty. It's amazing how in one paragraph in the old writing, it's telling us of the psychic powers of the Buddha, that his mind could clear turbid waters, and at the same time talking about his explosive diarrhea from dysentery. Okay? That's not something you generally expect to read in a sacred book. Okay? But for the Buddha, everything was about practicality and about this life and about becoming free in this life. When it came about the afterlife, it just wasn't important to him. He didn't talk about it, and he didn't say there wasn't one. He just said it's just not important. The only thing that's important is right now, today, and you're suffering today. And he understood the physical suffering because he was an old man by this time. A really old man. I think it's interesting, too, that within art, there are very few depictions of the Buddha as an old man. I find that kind of interesting. There is one statue, beautiful golden statue in China, that has Buddha depicted as an old man. I think that's kind of unfortunate that we don't have more depictions of him as the aged teacher. But we do learn from the last days of the Buddha that, as humans grow old, so do Buddhas. And we learn from the sutta that Ananda, his cousin and traveling companion for over 25 years, started to notice that, hey man, this guy we've been hanging out with all this time, he's getting old. Look at him. And I know a few of you understand that when you look in the mirror. I know I do. It's so strange to watch the passage of time. Ananda, his cousin, says to the Buddha, they would spend a lot of time just hanging out because he was his traveling companion, and he looks over and he said, so the story goes, now on that occasion, the Blessed One, on emerging from seclusion in the late afternoon, sat warming his back to the western sun. Then his cousin, Venerable Ananda, went to the Blessed One, and on arrival, having bowed down to the Blessed One, massaged his limbs and his hands, and said, "It's amazing, Lord. It's astonishing how the Blessed One's complexion is no longer so clear and bright. His limbs are flabby and wrinkled. His back bent forward. There's a discernible change in his faculties. The faculty of the eye, the faculty of the ear, the faculty of the nose, the faculty of the tongue, the faculty of the body. Ah, the fate of us all, even the Buddhas." It's interesting to think how delusional Western culture is with our worship of youth. We do not see old people. We ignore them. We're cussing them because they're driving too slow. We warehouse them away. We see aging as ugly, and we hide death in saran-wrapped meat. What great teaching our ancestors had of impermanence when grandmother would die in the family home. What are our views of impermanent old age and death? Do we avoid it, ignore it, tremble before it, or deny it and act as if though we have all the time in the world? Death is something that happens to other people, not to me. On a broader plane, it seems that death is the modern man's pornography with our obsession with zombies and serial killers. Do we love it more than we know? What about our obsession with violence and war? What is this relationship we have with the most universal of all things? It is said that the Buddha taught that death was the only thing in your life that was inevitable. And what is a healthy and liberating view of life and death? Gyomei Sensei speaks directly to this when he says, life becomes very different according to one's view of it. For example, if one's outlook or attitude towards life and death, it can make one either easily upset and gloomy, or it can make one's life harmonious, peaceful, and bright. Interesting, our view of life and death can make us peaceful and bright. Usually we don't think of the word bright when we think about death. Gyomei Sensei goes on to say that a healthy attitude and the realization that life includes both life and death, and they cannot be separated. Life is not only youth or growth, it also includes death. I heard a joke once. They said, well, what did they die from? What did they die from? And the person said, oh, they died from life. Because ultimately, that's the only thing you really can die from. He goes on to say that Westerners, we dichotomize life and death. Buddhism teaches the falseness of this, for life and death are not opposites, but are both phases of life and are complementary to each other. Life and death are neither good nor bad, ugly nor beautiful. They are just as they are, or as yourself are. Let's look back at what Ananda said and the Buddha's answers. So Ananda had just got done telling his cousin, dude, you're so old. And you can see or imagine the very old Buddha smiling at Ananda. Now I am frail, Ananda, old age, far gone in years. This is my 80th year and my life is spent. Even as an old cart, Ananda, is held together with much difficulty, so the body of the Tathagata is kept going with supports. How human is that? And how many of us, when we think of Buddhas, do we think of that old person in line taking forever to pull out their coupons to pay for their meal or to pay for their groceries at Walmart? Are we thinking of them as Buddhas? Or do we only see other people like us as Buddhas? No? He goes on to say, that is the way it is, Ananda. When young, one is subject to aging. When healthy, subject to illness. When alive, subject to death. The complexion is no longer clear and bright. The limbs are flabby and wrinkled. The back bent. Forward. There's discernible change in the faculties. The faculty of the eye, the faculty of the ear, the faculty of the nose, the faculty of the tongue, the faculty of the body. The message of Buddhism is that everything changes. And for me, the message of Nirvana Day is that impermanence is the very nature of all of existence. Even the Buddha, who is neither God nor human, is also subject to it. That even the construction of this thing I call myself, Christopher, is destined to come to an end. What that end means is different among different Buddhist traditions, but one thing is certain. Christopher as Christopher is impermanent and cannot be otherwise. But this very impermanence is what makes being alive possible. It allows change to be, which can make life even more beautiful. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. Life itself is possible. If a grain of corn is not impermanent, it can never be transformed into a stalk of corn. If the stalk were not impermanent, it could never provide us with an ear of corn we eat. If your daughter is not impermanent, she cannot grow up to become a woman. Then your grandchildren would never manifest. So instead of complaining about impermanence, we should say, warm welcome and long live impermanence. We should be happy when we can see the miracle of impermanence. Our sadness and suffering will pass. If it were not for impermanence, we could not awaken to reality as it is, or who we really are. If you live 1,000 years, how much more of a procrastinator would you be? Dude, so much I could do. Actually, so much I could think about doing and not do. I've been on Facebook for 200 years. Your friend-iversary! 200 years. Or is that Buddhist hell? I don't know. If it were not for that, if it were not for impermanence, where would the vitality be in being alive itself? What gratitude, what value could we see in life itself? Even with a faint awareness of our own impermanence, we struggle. Through our awareness and deeper experience of impermanence, we do not avoid the unavoidable, which is akin to trying to control the uncontrollable. But we turn towards our own impermanence and others' impermanence. This has everything to do with living in the here and now, in this moment. And in so doing, it changes everything. An author, R.A. Salvatore, writes, I have come to know that death, is an important thing to keep in mind. Not to complain or to make melancholy, but simply because only with the honest knowledge that one day I will die, can I truly begin to live today. I don't have an endless numbers of days. I struggle with my addictions, my television addiction. In those days that I fritter away hours of living to binge watch a TV show, I am delusional. Especially if you saw the shows I'm watching. When we can truly experience and embrace impermanence each day, how important are the things that we fret and scheme about? That we worry, that we turn inward or turn self-destructive about? When we embrace impermanence, we can truly be grateful for each moment. One of the hardest things to understand, especially when you're young, is impermanence, because you've only lived so short a time that you think all things will stay just as they are forever. And that's even hard when you become older. The beautiful thing about impermanence is all things come to an end. Your suffering will come to an end. But so will your joy. So don't get too egotistical. There's a story of a king who asked a Buddhist sage, I want you to create me a ring that will keep me in perspective, that will keep me humble in my life. That when I'm grateful, it will help me stay grounded. When I'm depressed, it will help lift me up. I want you to give me a ring that says one thing on it that I can always turn to it when I'm struggling. And the king, the sage comes back to the king, the jeweler, with a new ring. He hands it to the king, and inside the ring is written, "And this too shall pass." And this too shall pass. So sometimes when people say, "How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm happy," until I'm not. "Oh, I'm totally depressed," until I'm not. Because it's not a static thing. Life is not a static thing. And our suffering is because we want to make it a static thing. We try to force it to be a static thing. We try to make a black piece of paper white simply by wishing it. It's not possible. It is the nature of a white piece of paper to be white. It is the nature of a black piece of paper to be black. And so is life. When we can truly experience, embrace impermanence each day, how important are those little things that we worry so much about now? When we embrace impermanence, we can truly be grateful for each moment. I love this, and it's a story from Frank Ostanovsky's book, The 5 Invitations, which I highly recommend. It's the 5 Invitations on what death can teach us. And in there, somebody is sharing his impression of impermanence. "Do you see this glass? You see this glass?" he asks. "I love this glass. It holds water admirably. When the sun shines on it, it reflects light beautifully. When I tap it, it has a lovely ring. Yet for me, this glass is already broken. When the wind knocks it over or my elbow knocks it off the shelf and it falls to the ground and shatters, I say, 'Of course.' But when I understand this, that the glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious." Impermanence is the reminding that every moment is an unrepeatable miracle, literally. So many look for signs and wonders, looking for supernatural miracles, and at the same time are oblivious to the ones we see and experience every day, like the simple act of taking a breath. Just by breathing, we touch the ultimately inexplicable. It would be far simpler in this world and far more probable in the vastness of time and space for there to be nothing. But instead, we live in the midst of the improbable, in the miraculous now. And in some ways, by denying its impermanence, by denying that we die, we miss out on that awareness. I love this quote from Guillaume Sensei, and I've thought about it often since I first read it, and I kind of keep it always in the back of my mind. We should always be ready to die. Be able to say, "Thank you for everything." And quietly and naturally and peacefully say, "Goodbye." This is the challenge. To allow room for death. Because in reality, she's always with us. Death is not waiting at the end of our lives for us. She's in the DNA of now. She's present with us right now. Ours is to allow her to be our teacher, our motivator, and to be a bodhisattva of compassion. Also to teach us what we value most. Again, from R.A. Salvatore, we are all dying every moment that passes of every day. That is the inescapable truth of this existence. It is a truth that can paralyze us with fear, or one that can energize us with impatience, with the desire to explore and experience, with the hope, nay, the iron will to find a memory in every action, to be alive. To be alive under sunshine or starlight, in weather fair or stormy, to dance with every step, be they through gardens of flowers or through deep snows. And again from Gyome Sensei, the Buddha said that sickness and death are unavoidable because we are one with nature. Why do we think death is only a sad event? Death is not something to fear, as we are courageous in living and creating, so we should be about death. Everything has meaning and fulfillment. A lot of the monks, they're going, can you imagine having your teacher, having the Buddha with you for 45 years? I mean, he's always there. He's always been there. For a lot of the monks, they never knew a world without the Buddha. And now their teacher's dying. And I mean, you have to think these are monastics too. They've given up family and home, and the Sangha is their home, and the Buddha is their dad. And now he's dying. You know? And they're wailing. They're crying and they're sad. So accepting impermanence doesn't mean we still don't have our grieving process. Because I think that's part of the learning and part of the opening us up so that we can receive more teaching. That it helps our ego not to be so hard. It makes us pliable. Huh? Yes. There's something that Gyome Sensei teaches, that there is no self without others. Is that the very self that I say is me is because of the cause and conditions of my relationships with so many others. Whether it be someone I like, love, dislike, or disdain. For all of me, they are a part of me. They have all been my teachers and are in me now. If you want to know my ancestors, if you want to know my mom and my dad and my grandma and my grandpa, get to know me. Because they're in me. And they are very much alive. Every day. Within me. Even the womanizer grandfather who came back from the war and went back to England, falling in love with some British girl, the bastard. But he's in me too. You want to know my ancestors? Get to know me. If you want to know what their dreams were, their failures, their aspirations, their successes, we want to know all of our ancestors. We get to know that by getting to know one another. Because they are very much all in us and very much alive. I would love to share a quote from Christian Bobbin. He's a French lyrical essayist, and he writes, it's a story about a woman who takes him in. She tells me about herself. That is the people she loves. We are made of that. We are made of the people we love, nothing else. It is never closer than in a cluster of beloved faces, in the thoughts that go out to them, and in the breath that travels from them to us, from us to them. Anyone who put up a picture who would like to come to the altar and do a bow of gratitude for your ancestors is now invited and welcome to come up. If you're comfortable where you are, that's fine.